are not safe.
Hello, my fear seekers. I'm your fear master. You're in your bed, in total darkness, where every sound seems amplified and every shadow becomes an invisible threat. Tonight, I'll tell you stories that will make the darkness even more terrifying. So before you turn off the lights and let the unknown wrap around you, take a moment to drop a comment and share where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you have a chilling story to share, send it to the email in the description. You might just be the next star of our tales. These are tonight's horror stories. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the warmth of a simmering pot on the stove filled the air with the comforting scent of herbs and spices. I had just finished preparing dinner. The sizzling sound of the pan and the cozy atmosphere making the world outside feel distant and irrelevant. Just as I was about to sit down and enjoy my meal, a knock echoed through my apartment, startling me. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the warmth of a simmering pot on the stove filled the air with the comforting scent of herbs and spices. I had just finished preparing dinner. The sizzling sound of the pan and the cozy atmosphere making the world outside feel distant and irrelevant. Just as I was about to sit down and enjoy my meal, a knock echoed through my apartment, startling me. Who could that be at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and I live in a neighborhood where unexpected visitors are rare. Curiosity got the better of me. I wiped my hands on a towel and made my way to the door, peering through the peephole. To my surprise, no one was there. Just the dimly lit hallway, silent and still. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Should I open it or just ignore it? Before I could make up my mind, another knock came, louder this time, more insistent. An uneasy feeling crept up my spine, but I pushed it aside and slowly turned the handle. As I opened the door, I found a small, nondescript package sitting on the welcome mat. My name was scrawled across the front in neat handwriting, but there was no return address, no indication of where it had come from. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I quickly glanced up and down the hallway, still empty. My heart started to race as I picked up the package and closed the door behind me. I placed it on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might explode at any moment. Who would send me something like this? And why wouldn't they stay to hand it to me in person? Every rational thought told me to throw the package away, to leave it unopened and forget it ever existed. But curiosity is a powerful thing. With trembling hands, I grabbed a pair of scissors and began to carefully cut through the wrapping. What I found inside made my blood run cold. It was a severed hand, pale and lifeless, resting on a bed of crumpled paper. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my haste to get away from the gruesome sight. The package hit the floor with a dull thud, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Was this some kind of sick joke, or something far more sinister? Panic surged through me as my mind raced to make sense of what I was seeing. The thought of someone being out there, someone capable of sending such a thing, filled me with dread. I grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter to steady myself, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I needed to get out. to call the police, to do something, anything, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Then I heard it, a soft, wet thud behind me, like something heavy hitting the floor. The sound sent a jolt of terror through me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. As the realization hit me, I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes scanning the room. There was no one there, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife, and held it in front of me like a shield, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The only response was the eerie silence of my empty apartment. I stood there, knife in hand, for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Just the oppressive quiet and the lingering sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I needed to leave, to get out of there before whatever it was that had left that package returned. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, not daring to look back. As I fled down the hallway, the echoes of my footsteps seemed deafening, each one pushing me further away from the apartment and the horror within. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the street outside, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. I stood there, looking back at the building, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from one of the windows. But the building was silent, as if it held no secrets, no terror. I've always loved hiking, especially in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees and the sound of nature that makes me feel alive. So when I heard about Blackwood Forest, I couldn't resist checking it out, even though the locals warned me that it wasn't the safest place to explore. Blackwood Forest had a reputation. People said it was easy to get lost in there, that the dense trees and winding paths could disorient even the most experienced hikers. But I'd been on plenty of difficult hikes before, so I figured I'd be fine. I packed my gear, grabbed a map, and set off early one Saturday morning. The first few hours were peaceful. The forest was beautiful, with rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves, and the air was crisp and cool. I felt like I was the only person in the world. But as the day wore on, I realized that the trail was much more confusing than I'd anticipated. The paths seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't match up with the map, and soon I couldn't tell where I was. It was getting late, and the light was fading fast. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. That's when I first heard it, a faint whispering sound, like voices carried by the wind. I stopped, straining to hear, but the whispers seemed to come from all around me, impossible to pinpoint. At first I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like actual words, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was unnerving, but I tried to push the fear aside and focus on finding my way back to the main trail. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to get louder, more insistent, almost as if they were trying to guide me somewhere. Against my better judgment, I started following the sound, hoping it might lead me to another hiker or a familiar landmark. But the further I went, the more lost I felt. The forest grew darker, the trees closing in around me, and the whispers became more frantic, almost desperate. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow as I realized I was being led deeper into the forest, not out of it. Panic started to set in, and I turned around, trying to find my way back, but the whispers followed me, growing louder, more demanding. I began to run, branches slapping against my face and arms as I stumbled through the undergrowth. The whispers were all I could hear now, a chorus of voices urging me to go further, to keep going deeper into the darkness. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't keep following them. Finally, I broke through the trees into a small clearing. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, and looked around. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't wait to find out. I forced myself to stand and started walking in the opposite direction, away from the clearing, away from the whispers. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a familiar path that led me back to the edge of the forest. When I finally made it back to my car, the sun was rising. I hadn't realized how long I'd been out there, but it felt like I'd barely escaped something terrible. I haven't gone back to Blackwood Forest since that day, and I don't plan to. Whatever those whispers were, they weren't leading me to safety. They were leading me to something far more sinister. The drive to the mountains was long and winding, the road snaking through the rugged landscape like a ribbon of asphalt. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, eager to reconnect with my daughter after years of estrangement. But as I neared the cabin, nestled deep in the heart of the Colorado mountains, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me like a thick fog. I parked the car and stepped onto the gravel path, taking in my surroundings. The cabin looked deserted, its windows dark and empty. I called out for my daughter, but there was no response, only the distant sound of the wind whispering through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the front door and tried the handle, but it was locked. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I pulled out the spare key and unlocked the door, the hinges creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside the cabin was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and sharp. I searched every room, every corner, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had simply vanished. Panic began to set in as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I rushed outside, shouting her name, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Desperate, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods, following the narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the fading light of the day. As I walked, the silence pressed in around me, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. My breath came in the shallow gasps, fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. Hours passed, and the darkness grew thicker, the flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the trees. I called out for her again and again, my voice growing hoarse, but there was no answer, just the oppressive silence, heavy and suffocating. And then I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the wind. It was a cry, distant and muffled, but unmistakable. My heart leapt into my throat as I ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly. The cry grew louder, more frantic, until I stumbled upon a small clearing. There, at the edge of the clearing, I saw her, my daughter, huddled on the ground, her eyes wide with terror. But she wasn't alone. Standing over her was a figure, tall and gaunt, its face hidden in the shadows. It was something human, but there was something wrong, something twisted and unnatural about its presence. The air around it seemed to thrum with a palpable sense of malevolence. I froze, fear paralyzing me as the figure turned its head toward me, its eyes glinting in the darkness. For a moment, everything was still, just the three of us locked in a tense, silent standoff. And then, the figure moved. It lunged at me with a speed that defied logic, its movements fluid and predatory. I barely had time to react, swinging the flashlight at it in a desperate attempt to ward it off. The light connected with a sickening thud, and the figure recoiled, emitting a guttural hiss before disappearing into the shadows. I rushed to my daughter's side, pulling her into my arms as she trembled with fear. She was cold, her skin clammy and pale, but she was alive. We needed to get out of there, now. I helped her to her feet, and we stumbled back through the woods, the path twisting and turning in the darkness. My heart raced as we fled, the sense of being pursued gnawing at my every step. But we didn't stop, didn't look back, until we reached the cabin. Once inside, I barricaded the door and pulled my daughter close, both of us shaking with the adrenaline and terror of what had just happened. I knew we had to leave the mountains, leave this place far behind. But as I looked into my daughter's eyes, I saw a fear that would never leave her, a fear that had etched itself into her very soul. We escaped the mountains that night, but the nightmare followed us. It's a terror that haunts my dreams, a darkness that lingers just out of sight. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the wind whispering through the trees, carrying with it the echo of that malevolent presence, waiting, always waiting. A few months ago, I was exploring a small antique shop in a quiet town in upstate New York. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just browsing out of curiosity. The place was packed with all kinds of old furniture, vintage decor, and forgotten relics. But as I wandered toward the back of the shop, I saw it, a tall, ornate mirror with an intricately carved wooden frame. It had a sort of rustic charm, and something about it drew me in. Without much thought, I decided to buy it and take it home. My apartment in Syracuse isn't huge, but it has a cozy feel, and I figured the mirror would be a nice addition to my living room. I hung it on the wall opposite my couch, thinking it would make the space feel a bit larger. For the first few days, it was just that, a mirror, nothing more. But soon, things started to change. At first it was subtle. I'd walk past the mirror, and out of the corner of my eye I thought I saw my reflection move just a split second too late. It was almost imperceptible, so I brushed it off as my imagination. But then it happened again and again. The delay became more noticeable, and I began to feel a growing unease whenever I was near the mirror. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced up at the mirror. My reflection was there, of course, but something was off. I raised my hand to rub my eye, and there it was, the delay. My reflection hesitated before mimicking my movement, as if it had to think about it first. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was just an old mirror with some kind of imperfection in the glass. But then, the expressions started. I'd be staring into the mirror, and my reflection would suddenly smirk or frown when my face was completely neutral. The first time it happened, I was too shocked to react. I just stood there, staring at this twisted version of myself, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. But then, the expressions started. I'd be staring into the mirror, and my reflection would suddenly smirk or frown when my face was completely neutral. The first time it happened, I was too shocked to react. I just stood there, staring at this twisted version of myself, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Things escalated quickly after that. One night I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in front of the mirror. I leaned in closer to inspect something on my face. And that's when it happened. My reflection didn't lean in with me. Instead, it stayed back, watching me with a cold, detached expression. Then, slowly, it started to smile. A wide, unnatural grin that sent chills down my spine. In a panic, I backed away, knocking over the glass on the sink. I didn't dare look back at the mirror as I stumbled out of the bathroom, heart pounding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, like faint whispers coming from the living room, but I was too terrified to check. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I took the mirror down and drove it to a nearby junkyard, leaving it there without looking back. Whatever was in that mirror, I wanted no part of it. Since then, I haven't experienced anything strange, but the memory of that grin still haunts me. I don't know what that mirror was or where it came from, but I'm glad it's out of my life. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. My boyfriend, Jake, and I had planned it for weeks. A drive through the quiet back roads of the Pacific Northwest, away from the stress of our daily lives. We wanted to reconnect, to enjoy the open road, and take in the scenic views. But what started as a peaceful getaway quickly turned into a nightmare. We were on the second day of our trip, cruising along a deserted highway that cut through miles of dense forest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was exactly what we had hoped for, until we noticed the truck. It was an old, beat-up pickup, the kind that looked like it had seen better days. At first, it was just a speck in the rearview mirror, but it wasn't long before it was right behind us, tailgating dangerously close. Jake frowned and eased off the gas, hoping the truck would pass us, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed on our tail, its headlights glaring into our mirrors. "What the hell is this guy's problem?" Jake muttered, glancing at me with a mix of frustration and concern. "I don't know, but I don't like it," I replied, my voice tense. Jake sped up, trying to put some distance between us and the truck, but it matched our speed, staying right on our bumper. My heart started to race, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, especially this aggressive. We decided to pull over, thinking the truck would finally pass us if we got out of its way. Jake slowed down, signaling as we moved onto the shoulder, but instead of passing, the truck screeched to a halt behind us, its engine rumbling ominously. "Don't get out," I whispered urgently, my eyes fixed on the side mirror. Jake nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly as we both watched the truck. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a mask that obscured his face completely. The mask was plain, featureless, just a blank canvas of menace. The stranger stood there, staring at us through the mask, not moving, not saying a word. The tension was unbearable. My breath caught in my throat as the figure started walking toward our car, each step deliberate and slow. "Go, Jake. Go now," I urged, panic rising in my voice. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the car into gear and floored the gas pedal. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, and we sped off down the road. I looked back, and the masked man was just standing there, watching us go. But the truck, it was still right behind us. The chase was on. No matter how fast Jake drove, the truck stayed with us, its headlights glaring and its engine roaring like a beast. The road twisted and turned through the forest, but there was no escaping it. The driver seemed to know every curve, every bend, as if he had done this 100 times before. Fear gripped me as I realized we couldn't outrun him. "We need to find a place to stop, somewhere safe," I said, my voice trembling. Jake nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "There's got to be a gas station or something up ahead." But there wasn't. The road stretched on endlessly, with no sign of civilization. And then, just as we thought we might have a chance, the truck rammed into us from behind, the impact jolting us forward. Jake fought to keep control of the car as the truck slammed into us again, harder this time. "We can't keep this up," Jake shouted, his voice filled with desperation. I scanned the road ahead, and finally I saw it, a small dirt road branching off to the right. "There, turn there." Jake swerved onto the dirt road, the tires skidding as we hit the loose gravel. The truck followed, but the narrow path slowed it down. It was our only chance. Jake pushed the car as hard as he could, the engine straining as we tore down the rough track. The trees closed in around us, their branches scraping against the sides of the car. But the truck wasn't giving up. It barreled down the dirt road, gaining on us with every second. Just when it seemed like there was no escape, the road opened up into a clearing, and in the distance I saw the faint lights of a cabin. "There, head for the cabin," I yelled, pointing frantically. Jake didn't hesitate. He gunned the engine, heading straight for the lights. The truck was still behind us, but it was losing ground on the uneven terrain. We reached the cabin and skidded to a stop, jumping out of the car and running for the door. We pounded on the door, praying someone was inside. To our relief, an old man opened it, his face creased with concern. "Get in, quick," he urged, pulling us inside and slamming the door shut behind us. We huddled inside, our hearts racing as the truck's engine roared outside. But it didn't stop. After a few tense moments, we heard it drive off, its tires crunching on the gravel as it disappeared into the night. We stayed in that cabin until morning, too scared to leave. When the sun finally rose, we thanked the old man and drove back to the main road. The truck was gone, but the terror of that night stayed with us. We never found out who the masked driver was or why he had targeted us, but we never took a backroad road trip again. There's a unique stretch of I-40 in New Mexico, between Socorro and Gallup, spanning over 100 miles without any services. No hotels, no restaurants, no gas stations, only a few scenic pullouts where you can stop briefly. It's a grueling drive, and don't get me wrong, those New Mexico mountains are breathtaking during the day, and at night you get one of the clearest views of the stars you'll ever find. But 100 miles is a long way, especially at night. Anyone who's driven that stretch of the interstate can tell you it's not very busy, even during the day. By nightfall, the traffic thins out even more, and by midnight, you can drive for miles without seeing another car's headlights. And let's not even talk about cell service out there. It's definitely not a place you want to get stranded, especially at night. The idea of getting stuck there on a dark night, with no one around for miles, is enough to make anyone think twice before attempting the journey. Unfortunately for me, I was in a hurry, so I decided to go for it. A bit of background. I'm originally from a city called Cedar Rapids in Iowa, mainly known for its cornfields and the University of Iowa. I was born and raised there, lived there until I was about 25. Then decided that since I was single and childless, it was time to get out and explore. So I took a job in Los Angeles and moved west. Most of my family still lives in Cedar Rapids, so I try to visit now and then. This particular Sunday, I got a call from my mom around 2 p.m. My grandfather, who had been in a nursing home since having a stroke, was deteriorating rapidly. They didn't expect him to make it to the end of the week, so if I wanted to see him, I needed to do it sooner rather than later. Fortunately, I was off work, which meant I had the time to go see him. Last-minute flights can be pretty expensive, so I decided to drive. I'd made the trip before. It certainly wasn't fun, but it was a much cheaper option, and I thought I should try to drive the whole way. Luckily for me, I'd had my car serviced a couple of weeks earlier. 2 hours later, I was packed and on the road with my dog, Chance. The trip was pretty uneventful for the most part. Daylight faded, and I remember being disappointed that I'd be driving through New Mexico and most of Arizona at night, missing out on the beautiful scenery. I love stargazing, but it's hard to enjoy it when you're driving at 80 miles per hour, and since I was in a hurry, I wasn't going to stop to take a closer look. So, I resigned myself to singing loudly to stay awake. We've all been there, right? A little after midnight, I finally reached Socorro, New Mexico. I passed the billboard warning drivers of what was ahead. No services for 104 miles. It's paid for by the town of Socorro, and it's a good thing, too. According to the gas station employees, several times a week someone walks into the building because they ran out of gas. So I stopped, filled up the tank, and got right back on the road. It had snowed recently. The roads were clear, but there was still snow piled up on the sides. Now, I'm the kind of driver who speeds everywhere. The speed limit on this particular stretch of road is usually around 80 miles per hour, so I normally go about 90 miles per hour, except on the steep inclines, of which there are many. I had been driving for about 30 minutes at this point. I had passed a few cars several miles back, but they were too far away to see their headlights. Have you ever driven on a road alone late at night and marveled at how dark it really is? and how alone you really are. Sometimes when I'm on a trip like this, and I hit a long stretch of road, I like to turn off my headlights while driving just for a few seconds to see what it looks like when there's almost no light around. It's almost cathartic. Suddenly, while I'm driving, I hear a loud bang, and the car jerks to the right, or maybe the left. I can't remember. My low tire pressure indicator is flashing, and I brake hard. After straightening the car, I pull over to the side of the road and turn on my hazard lights. Chance is going crazy. I've had a tire blowout before, so I know what to expect. Getting out of the car, my front right tire is completely flat. I tried to walk closer to see what had happened, but even with my iPhone flashlight, it was still too dark to see. I checked my phone, and of course there was no cell service. I rolled down the back window so Chance could stick his head out and get some fresh air while I replaced the tire. I got to work, muttering to myself that, of course, I'm halfway to Gallup, and I'll have to drive the rest of the way on my spare tire, which will slow me down significantly. I took the spare and the jack out of the trunk and went to start. As I approached the front of my car, I froze. Someone was walking towards me, their silhouette barely visible at the edge of my headlights. Chance didn't make a sound. They kept walking until they were about 30 feet from my car. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, just that they were tall, maybe 6'5" or 6'6". At this point, no car had passed going east since I stopped, so after the initial shock of seeing another person, my first thought was, where did this person come from? They just stood there, motionless, staring at us. Chance still didn't make a sound, but now he was staring intently at the figure, just like I was. I won't lie. I was terrified. Who was this person? Where did they come from? And why were they just staring at me? Why wasn't Chance barking like he usually does at anything that moves? I dropped the spare tire and hesitantly asked, "Hello?" Still hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was no response. They didn't move a muscle. It was less than 30 degrees, and they weren't even shivering. "Hello?" I asked again, a bit louder this time. At this point, I started wondering if this person needed help more than I did. I opened my mouth to speak again when I finally heard something. "Do you need help?" the man asked weakly. For the first time, I could tell it was a man based on his voice. It wasn't as deep as you'd expect from a man of his size, which I found strange. But he still hadn't moved. "Where did you come from?" I asked. I didn't see any taillights ahead of me, and no one had passed since I stopped. "How long have you been here?" I started walking slowly towards the front of my car, with the tire iron firmly in my hand. The man made no visible movements, but he said again, "Do you need help?" I stopped walking and tried to get a better look at him. I couldn't make out any physical features, but I noticed he wasn't dressed for winter. I was wearing sweatpants, a winter jacket, and I was still cold. But here was this man in a short-sleeved t-shirt. He kept his face down the whole time. By now I was really starting to get scared. "Do you need help?" This time his voice sounded wrong, like he was struggling with each word. I started to edge around the front of my car, towards the driver's door. If nothing else, I could get in my car and lock the doors. I still had my tire iron, but I never considered myself physically intimidating, and I knew that if it came down to it, this tire iron might not help me overcome the height difference. He spoke again. "Do you need help? Do you need help? Do you need help?" His voice became more urgent. He finally took a step towards me, still repeating, "Do you need help? Do you need help?" He was talking faster now. I moved quickly around the car and found the driver's door handle. Just as I was about to open it, a light appeared behind me. Instinctively, I turned to see a pair of headlights approaching on the interstate. Chance started barking loudly. I turned back, expecting to see the man closing in on me, but he was gone. Chance was still barking. "Hello?" I shouted, but there was nothing. No breathing, no movement, no response. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what was happening. The approaching car drove past me. They didn't stop. I don't blame them. Would you stop for a random car on the side of a desolate highway? I didn't even think to flag them down. I was still trying to process what had just happened. Did I imagine it all? I walked forward, approaching the area where the man had been standing. There were footprints in the snow. They started where the man had been standing, extending off into the distance along the road. I still held my tire iron. I turned on my phone's flashlight and followed the footprints. They went for about 10 feet and then turned. They went directly off the road to the south and disappeared. Now, I'm not stupid enough to follow footprints across the New Mexico desert in the middle of the night, but whatever it was, I was curious. More headlights coming from behind brought me back to my senses. I went back to my car, changed the tire, and got back on the road, though at a much slower pace. The rest of the trip was as uneventful as the beginning, and I didn't feel the need to mention the encounter to anyone. Sure, it was creepy, but I still wasn't entirely convinced I didn't imagine the whole thing. It was late, and I had been driving for nearly 9 hours straight. But I'll tell you one thing for sure. I definitely don't want to drive that stretch of road again to find out. It was a typical late night when I found myself driving home after a long day at work. The road was deserted, and the only light came from the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the inky darkness. I was used to these solitary drives, but that night, something felt different. Something felt wrong. I was about halfway home, cruising down a stretch of highway, flanked by dense woods on either side, when I noticed a car behind me. It was keeping pace with me, matching my speed exactly. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. I decided to test it. I slowed down, hoping they would pass me, but they slowed down too, maintaining the same distance. My heart started to race. There was no reason for anyone to be on this road at this hour, especially not this far out of town. I sped up, but so did they. It was like they were playing a game, one that I wanted no part of. I kept driving, my eyes flicking nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. The car was still there, its headlights glaring into my rearview mirror, almost blinding me. I could barely make out the shape of the driver, a dark silhouette behind the wheel. It felt like a predator stalking its prey, and I was the prey. I tried to think rationally, to calm the panic rising in my chest. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I told myself, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I needed to get away from them, but the road ahead was nothing but endless darkness, and I knew there weren't any turnoffs or gas stations for miles. Then, without warning, the car behind me surged forward, closing the gap between us in seconds. It was right on my bumper now, its headlights so close that I could see the grime on my rear window. My heart pounded in my ears as I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. This wasn't just someone following me, this was someone chasing me. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as I pushed my car to its limits. The speedometer climbed higher, but the car behind me stayed right on my tail. I swerved left and right, trying to shake them, but they mirrored my every move. Suddenly, the road ahead split into 2 lanes. Without thinking, I swerved into the left lane, hoping to lose them in the turn. But as soon as I did, the car behind me followed, cutting me off and forcing me back into the right lane. They were toying with me, and I had no idea how to escape. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the car sped up and pulled alongside me. I glanced over and saw the driver for the first time, a shadowy figure with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. They were staring directly at me, their gaze piercing and cold. Panic surged through me, and I yanked the wheel to the right, desperate to get away. My car swerved off the road, tires screeching as I fought to regain control. I veered onto the shoulder, gravel spraying in all directions. The other car slowed down, cruising past me before disappearing into the night, as if they had gotten what they wanted. I sat there for a moment, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. The road was empty again, as if nothing had happened, but the terror I felt was all too real. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, or the way the car had pursued me with such deliberate intent. I finally managed to pull myself together and drove the rest of the way home, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that car again. But it never reappeared. When I got home, I locked every door and window, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I never found out who that driver was or why they chose to terrorize me that night. But I'll never forget the fear that gripped me, or the way it felt to be hunted on that dark, lonely road. As a park ranger in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, I've seen my share of strange and unsettling things. The wilderness can be a place of peace and beauty, but it can also hide darker secrets beneath its canopy of towering trees. I've always taken pride in my ability to handle whatever the job throws at me, but one night, I stumbled upon something that shook me to my core. It was late in the season, and the number of visitors had dwindled as the weather turned colder. My job that evening was routine, making my rounds, checking the campsites to ensure they were clear and safe for the next day. Most of the campsites were empty, the last campers having packed up and gone home. But as I approached one of the more remote sites, I noticed something that made me pause. The campsite looked deserted at first glance, but something was off. The tent was still pitched, but it was half collapsed, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. The fire pit was cold, but scattered around it were belongings, clothes, a backpack, some cooking gear, left behind, as if the campers had fled suddenly. But what really caught my attention was the dark stain on the ground, soaking into the earth near the fire pit. Blood, and a lot of it. My heart began to race as I approached the scene, my hand instinctively moving to the radio on my belt. I called it in, reporting the situation, but there was no response, just static. The isolation of the remote location, combined with the ominous silence of the forest, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Something terrible had happened here, and I was the first to stumble upon it. I began to search the area, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. The ground around the campsite was disturbed, signs of a struggle clear in the trampled underbrush and scattered gear. The blood trail led into the trees, a crimson path disappearing into the dense forest. I knew I should wait for backup, but something drove me forward, a need to find out what had happened. I followed the trail, moving cautiously, every sense on high alert. The deeper I went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around me, the air thick with a sense of impending danger. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed on, driven by a mixture of duty and dread. After what felt like an eternity, I found him, the attacker. He was hunched over something on the ground, his back to me, his hands covered in blood. He didn't seem to notice my approach, too focused on whatever he was doing. As I got closer, I could see that he was digging, desperately, frantically, trying to bury something or someone. I called out to him, my voice firm but shaky. "Hey, park ranger, step away and put your hands up." He froze, then slowly turned to face me. His eyes were wild, wide with a mix of fear and madness. His face was smeared with blood, and in his hand he clutched a hunting knife, its blade glinting in the fading light. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with tension. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hand hovering over the pepper spray on my belt. And then he lunged. Everything happened in a blur. I barely had time to react, jumping back as he slashed at me with the knife. I dodged, pulling out the pepper spray and blasting him in the face. He screamed, dropping the knife as he clawed at his eyes, and I took the opportunity to tackle him to the ground. We struggled, rolling in the dirt, but I managed to pin him down, holding him there until I could secure him with a pair of handcuffs I always carried for emergencies. By the time backup arrived, the man was incoherent, mumbling to himself in a language I didn't understand. The scene was processed, the bloodstains documented, but the body he had been trying to bury was never found. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the horror of what had happened. I never forgot that night. The terror and the adrenaline, the feeling of being so close to something so dark and primal. It changed the way I saw the forest, no longer just a place of beauty and tranquility, but also a place where danger could lurk, unseen, waiting to strike. A couple of months ago, something really strange happened to my mom, and it still gives me chills just thinking about it. We live in a quiet little town in Vermont, where nothing much ever happens, so this really shook us up. It all started one evening when my mom, Lisa, and I were relaxing after dinner. She got a phone call from her friend, Sarah, which wasn't unusual. They talk all the time. But this time, Sarah said she was calling my mom back because she had missed her call earlier in the day. The thing is, my mom swore she never called Sarah. My mom is one of those people who always puts her phone on speaker, so I heard the whole conversation. Sarah insisted she got a call from my mom's number, even said she got a voicemail. Naturally, my mom was confused. She checked her call log, and there was no record of her calling Sarah at all. Things got even weirder when Sarah forwarded the voicemail to my mom. When we listened to it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The voice on the recording was exactly like my mom's. It said, "Hey, this is Lisa. Just wanted to check in. Call me back when you can. Bye." But my mom never left that message. To make things even creepier, the call didn't come from my mom's number. It came from a completely different number that neither of us recognized. My mom, being the practical and slightly paranoid person she is, decided to call the number back. It rang a few times, and then a voicemail picked up. "Hi, this is Jacob. I can't get to the phone right now." We don't know anyone named Jacob. The whole thing left us both feeling really uneasy. My mom doesn't have any kind of online presence. She barely uses her smartphone for anything other than calls and texts. So how could someone have recorded her voice and used it like that? And why? Ever since that night, I've been more paranoid about technology. I even put tape over the camera on my laptop just in case. We never got another weird call like that, and no one else in my mom's contacts has either. But still, it's something that lingers in the back of my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, might still be listening. It was one of those small-town diners you only see in movies, hidden away on a back road, with flickering neon lights and a faded sign that read, "Open 24 hours." I had been driving for hours, lost somewhere between where I'd been and where I was going, when the diner's soft glow cut through the darkness like a beacon. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered here and there, their owners probably locals who had wandered in for a late-night coffee or a slice of pie. I parked my car and stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly as I entered. The warmth of the diner was a welcome change from the cold night air, and I took a deep breath, savoring the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon. A waitress, the kind who's been there long enough to know everyone by name, greeted me with a tired smile and handed me a worn menu. "Sit wherever you like, honey," she said, her voice as warm as the diner itself. I chose a booth near the window, the view outside a blur of shadows and distant headlights. The menu was simple, full of the kind of comfort food you'd expect in a place like this. Burgers, pancakes, fries. But one item caught my eye, written in neat, faded handwriting. "Special dish." There was no description, no indication of what it might be. Just those two words. Curiosity piqued. I decided to order it. The waitress didn't bat an eye when I asked for the special, just nodded and headed back to the kitchen. As I waited, I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth seep through me. The diner was quiet, save for the soft hum of the radio playing an old country song. It felt like a place frozen in time, untouched by the world outside. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, a strange feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, but the other diners were absorbed in their own conversations or staring at their phones. Still, that uneasy feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of my mind. The waitress returned with my food, placing the plate in front of me with a knowing smile. "Enjoy," she said, before walking away. I looked down at the plate, my mouth watering despite my unease. The dish was unlike anything I had ever seen, a perfectly cooked piece of meat, surrounded by colorful vegetables that looked like they had been picked just moments before. The aroma was intoxicating, a blend of spices that made my stomach rumble in anticipation. I took a bite, and the flavors exploded in my mouth, rich, savory, with a hint of something sweet. It was unlike anything I had ever tasted, a perfect harmony of tastes that left me wanting more. Each bite was better than the last, and before I knew it, I had cleared the plate, every last morsel. As I finished, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like a wave of warmth and contentment, but also something else, something darker, more insidious. My vision blurred for a moment, and I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. I looked up, expecting to see the waitress, but instead, the diner was empty. The other customers had vanished, the lights flickering ominously above me. Panic began to rise in my chest as I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice sounded distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. The door to the kitchen swung open slowly, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. The waitress stepped out, her face now devoid of the warmth she had shown earlier. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and she smiled, a cold, knowing smile that sent fear coursing through me. "How was your meal?" she asked, her voice no longer the comforting tone I remembered. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth moved, but no sound emerged. She stepped closer, and I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're one of us now," she said, her smile widening. "Welcome." Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw them, shadows moving at the edges of my vision, figures watching me with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was still in the booth, the diner bustling with activity as if nothing had happened. The waitress was nowhere to be seen, and my plate had been cleared away. I stood up, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. Was it a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? I couldn't be sure. But as I left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I couldn't explain. The road ahead seemed darker, more foreboding, and I drove on, unable to forget the special dish that had left a lingering taste of fear in my mouth. And with that, I hope the darkness in your room feels just a little uncomfortable. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for our next round of guaranteed insomnia. Remember, new true scary stories for Sleep with Rain Sounds and Black Screen every Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. EST. If you've got a story that could give the Fearmaster nightmares, send it my way. This is your Fearmaster, signing out.